Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Rufus Peabody. Rufus, thank you very much for coming on. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @bettingpod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Rufus Peabody. Rufus, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
So Rufus, most know you from Bet the Process podcast or maybe Massey Peabody. Tell us how you got started. What was the first exposure you had to sports betting?
So I guess the first exposure I had to sports betting was in high school when I ran March Madness NCAA tournament pools. But that's not betting in the real sense. That's more game theory. And I think at one point in college, I signed up for one of these. I don't even remember what site it was, probably Bodog or something, and put like $50 in. And I fancy myself, to know a little bit about baseball, but I had absolutely no analytics behind it. And I think I remember losing a few bets and then putting the remainder on the Angels laying -150 in some game and losing that and being like, okay, I'm not any good at this. But I read an article on ESPN.com, I guess this was in 2007, by Gene Wojciechowski, where he was embedded with Las Vegas sports consultants on Selection Sunday. And so I think the article basically said, if you think you know sports, you think you know NCAA basketball, like you actually know nothing. These people will tell you exactly how you're wrong. And so, the company Las Vegas Sports Consultants consulted at the time for 90% of the legal sports books in the state of Nevada. So they provided opening odds. And I read this article and I thought it was the most fascinating, interesting thing ever because I'd always been interested in the number side of sports growing up. And I was like, this is like my dream job. So I, Googled the company. I found a website with absolutely nothing on it, but a contact phone number and called and tried to get in touch with the head honcho there, Kenny White. And, I think it was like phone tag for at least a month where they said call back in 2 Sundays at 3 p.m. And I did, and they had forgotten all about me by that time. So, but eventually I talked my way into an internship out there where I actually got Yale to pay for, actually pay for me to go out there. Cause at the time I wanted to do my senior thesis on how did I express it? I said analyzing the integrity of amateur athletics, basically trying to detect point shaving and stuff like that. And it just so happened that during my summer out at LVSC, the Tim Donaghy story happened to break. So I actually got a chance firsthand to sort of look into try to detect the point shaving. But after that, I decided to do my senior thesis on psychological inefficiencies in the baseball betting market and to build a baseball betting model, which was a lot more practically useful, as it turns out. And I took a job with LVSC out of college. And after working there for a year, in which I was mostly, developing my own models, doing stuff with NFL props. I was doing stuff with the company, monitoring line movements and stuff as well, but spending a lot of time on my own developing models and hustling from casino to casino, placing bets and finding good derivative values and just all the sort of small market stuff that you do when you're starting. And after a year, I had made connections with people that were well financed and willing to basically give me a shot and bankroll me. And so after a really good month to start the baseball season, these guys were basically convinced me to quit because that I was basically working for minimum wage at LVSC, and I had made my yearly salary in my first month with these other guys. So it was the best decision I ever made.
Tell me about the Tim Donaghy stuff. What was your experience with what happened there?
So to be honest, my analysis was looking at it now was not incredibly detailed or rigorous in any form. But what I found was that it was a trend towards the over. It was something like 20-2 in games where you had you had a strong move to the over, but it wasn't just a big move to the over. It was you had a bunch of different line moves, especially close to game time, and you had a lot of resistance at the end. So, and the moves were right around like 6 p.m., which is, I guess the theory goes that's when these local bookies are closing up and trying to lay their action offshore. And so those trends, it was a very strong trend, but at the same time, I didn't actually have data from every other referee to compare it to. So it wasn't a rigorous analysis in any way, shape, or form. But the funny thing is nobody in the office there had a true stats background. And I was just an econ major who had taken a few stats courses. And I happened to actually have more of a statistical background than anybody else at the office.
If I told you today that there was cricket match fixing going on and I gave you a whole bunch of data that you could find in 2019, do you think you would have a better chance of finding real evidence or proof of certain match fixing or any sport, not just cricket?
A better chance than
back then, where it sounds like there wasn't enough access to enough information or enough detailed referee statistics or enough even betting data information.
Yeah, I think so. I think having that information is extremely valuable for that. I don't think it would be an easy thing to do at all, and I don't think you can ever prove that something is necessarily wrong. I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of, you're the lawyer here, but what, circumstantial evidence or something like that. You can, but I guess it can inform where to look, right? And where to sort of dig deeper.
Yeah, there's always a threshold or a burden, and I guess with sports and generally how sports work around the world, there's different access to information through the sport and also different, powers that police may not even have. So anyway, it's a story for another day. I'm curious, in your first year at LVSC, did you love what you were doing? And I guess coming straight out of Yale and writing a thesis and all of that, it was probably a crazy experience for you.
Yeah, I did love it. I remember, it was my first time living on my own too. It's just, I don't know. What was your first job out of college? Do you remember that well?
Yeah, I worked in a restaurant called the Fitz Cafe, making coffees or delivering coffees, I suppose.
And I'm guessing it had its ups and downs.
Correct.
And I think that was my experience at LVSC. The job was amazing, but I paid virtually nothing. I think my salary was $25,000, and I had just bought a used car, a 2008 Honda Civic, and driven it cross country from DC, which is where I grew up, the DC area, to Vegas. And I by the way, I still have that car. It's still out in Vegas, but I remember before I had to spend all this money to get an apartment before I actually got my first paycheck. And I still remember once, literally crying in the bathroom stall of LVSC to my mom and being like, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it. I just had one of those moments where I think this was the 3 weeks into the job where I was like, I don't think this is going to be able to work, but luckily it did. And it was a fantastic year. It was a fantastic job. And the people I was working with weren't stats people per se, but they were all people that had a lot of years of experience in this industry, and they were extremely comfortable with numbers and, had developed their own systems. And while it's not advanced statistical analysis, it's a lot of research, and they worked really hard. And what impressed me, Kenny White, for example, my boss, had, he actually asked me to look and try to see the value of different things, different, I guess, statistics for basketball in terms of developing this rating system he did. And he had these values he assigned to them in terms of assigning a player a rating. And when I actually looked statistically at it, it was amazing how close the numbers that he had sort of come up with, presumably out of thin air, or just based on his knowledge of the sport and years of experience. Like, they were so close to what statistically, like what my regression said they should have been. So,
yeah, that's a fascinating concept and idea that certain people have the ability to, I guess, internalize and process what they know and understand and assign values that are close to what the statistics people or the modelers out there would find.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I mean, I used to discount this whole experience thing, and I think looking back on my time at LVSC, I think there are, I think, two people especially that I feel like I kind of rubbed the wrong way over a little bit. I think threatened by me, because I think I came in sort of saying, like, I've looked at this academically. I had actually, the summer before, the same, right before I did my internship at LVSC, I'd been hired by a professor at Yale to do this research. Well, I had applied for this research opportunity on something else, but I talked to him about all this research I was doing myself on point shaving and stuff just on my own. And he saw my passion, I guess, and actually he had to referee a paper related to sports betting. And so he had me do an academic literature review on sports betting. So before I went out there, I had this, like, I had read every academic paper about sports betting in the last 35, 40 years. I knew all about the utility theory and basically just all these theories explaining, all these biases in the market, why bookmakers should shade the line, somewhere between the true price and the price that equalizes supply and demand. And so I think I came in there a little arrogant. I thought I knew everything, and I certainly didn't. And so but it's funny now when I've worked with some other people or tried to bring on people, some of the guys I talked to, they kind of remind me of me then, and I feel like they have this great statistical background or they have these skills, but at the same time, I'm sort of like, well, but you need to approach it like this. I've realized there is something to experience, and having done this so many times and having made mistakes, you kind of see what works and see what doesn't work.
So that first month you spent betting baseball that you referenced earlier, where you won a fair bit of money, looking back, was that luck and variance in a very small sample size that went your way, or do you think you were just well and truly really, really, really positive EV, and most of the time you would have ended up on the right side?
So I think I had an edge for sure, but I think it was definitely positive variance, having a really good first month. And if I had let's say I'd had let's say, I don't know how many sigmas it was to the positive, but what if I had a 2 standard deviations worse than expected month? Those people probably would not have wanted to keep me on. They might have decided to quit on the free roll, and I could be in a different industry entirely.
Absolutely. And those free rolls, do they still happen today?
Well, I mean, I know people still do free rolls. I don't have a ton of experience with them, but I think they do make sense for somebody that is if you want to. I mean, I like the idea of somebody having skin in the game. So let's say someone came to me with this idea for a model, or they thought they had a good model. I think it does make some sense if it's over a long enough period of time where the incentives are truly aligned, and you think that it's a positive EV play. But I guess giving somebody a free roll, an up and coming handicapper, is a gamble on its own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's certainly not something you hear about or people talk about too much. And I guess even if it does happen, that person who is betting their model probably doesn't want to go into too much detail about it anyway.
That's true.
So I guess one question I was going to ask later on, but I'll ask now, is around how do you battle the small sample size element to sports betting with having confidence in your model and trying to find those plus EV bets?
I mean, that's tough. It's I guess from a psychological perspective, it's tough, but I kind of rely on the long-term track record. And I mean, I guess one example is the Massey Peabody stuff I do, our NFL picks against the spread. were very bad in 2016, which was the year I did some work for ESPN. And I think every time I went on TV and gave a pick, it basically lost. I went something like 1-11 on SportsCenter. But overall, it was the first year we'd had for Massey Peabody where our picks had a losing record. And we bounced back in 2017, but 2018 had a losing record as well. But the thing with that is that despite the fact that the picks I gave out lost, like the stuff I was betting overall won. And the problem, because I'm betting myself generally on earlier in the week with NFL stuff. And so a lot of the plays I'm giving out are ones that had market resistance, and the market is getting more efficient. And so even though I'm down over the course of 3 seasons, I still think that the stuff I'm giving out does have some value. I don't think it has necessarily the same value that it used to have, or that a play with the same projected edge, not accounting for the time in the week, basically, because I regress my stuff more to the market later in the week than I do early in the week, because I think that the market is the market is obviously less efficient earlier in the week. So, but I still think it has positive EV. It is frustrating that the stuff that this is kind of what I do to, in a way, prove myself, right? Because everybody's judged against something, and the Massey Peabody picks sort of made a name for themselves because they were winning picks, and they were free, and they were publicly available. And so for 3 years, our picks are down over that span. So that's frustrating. But at the same time, I have to trust the fact that, I've still been making money overall betting NFL in that time frame. It's just it's one of those things. And also, if let's say you're expecting to hit 54% and you're let's say picking 60 games a season, you're going to have a good fraction of those seasons where you hit below 50%. So
yeah, there's a lot of simulations that, hit well below as well. So it's, I guess, one question on the betting side then, and you mentioned NFL, and, a 50, 60 pick sample size is obviously not a lot at all. And if someone agrees that markets tend towards efficiency and NFL is probably the most efficient market in the world, or one of, then it probably sounds like a good idea to utilize that number as an anchor and then go from there and try and implement, first half, second halves, other derivatives if you can, prop bets and things like that. Is that something that you would advise generally for a lot of people who are looking at those picks? They're not just something to go and bet. It's something to utilize as a rating, as something within your arsenal.
Yes, I think that's the case for sure, especially if you have these sort of models to price derivatives. But because I myself am betting, yes, first half, second halves, not as much on props anymore, just because the limits aren't really there, and it's easy way to, betting a bunch of props is a great way to lose places to bet. But I think, interestingly though, I think the prop market may be, and I think, you can speak to this more than I can, but with legalization, I think, and places like DraftKings and FanDuel seeming to have a lot of offerings there, I think the prop market could actually get a little bit bigger going forward.
Yeah, it'll depend on how quickly things roll out and the different offerings in different states, but it's certainly something that's talked about a lot. It's certainly talked about a lot on US sports currently, so we'll see how that evolves, and if the leagues want to embrace it, if the operators want to embrace it, and how it ultimately ends up. On the modeling side, so for example, that NFL model you mentioned, let's say over a 6-season period, how much of it is changing? How much of it is updating? You don't have to speak anything proprietary, but just generally, is it being tweaked a fair bit, or is it steady and stable across that period of time?
No, there have been tweaks, and if you go back, so we started this in 2010, and the impetus for this was this journalist Michael Salfino came to Cade Massey, and Cade was my senior thesis advisor at Yale. He approached him about an NFL rating system for the Wall Street Journal, because Michael was doing some writing for the Wall Street Journal, and Cade came to me and said, if I do this, let's how would you want to collaborate on it? And so it started out as only is just ratings based on what happened on the field during the season. So for the first 2 seasons, we didn't use priors at all. And so we had some crazy looking things early in the season. And it was more of the intention wasn't as much to be like just betting. It was, because obviously you can get a lot more information using a prior, like not knowing, thinking that Peyton Manning is the same quarterback as, I don't know, Mark Redmond going into a season is not really, you're throwing out a lot of signal that way. But then we kind of, when I realized how well it actually was doing, despite the fact, like, especially later in the season, despite the fact that it wasn't using priors, like against the spread, I was like, well, let's do this for real. Let's implement priors. And so that was our first big change in going to the 2012 season. And it became like more of a true, like, predictive model. And we've made changes every offseason since. We've tweaked things and tried some things. But at the same time, I think part of the beauty of it is in its simplicity. We don't try to, we're not overfitting too much. I think what we're trying to do is contextualize as much as we can. And I'm not going to get into too many of the details, but we, every off season, we get together and we have ideas for how to improve it based on what we've seen during the season and just our thoughts. And I try to write those down during the season, but it's hard. And it seems like I always get inspiration during the season, and that's the time when I never have time to actually work on things. And so inevitably it's July and we're sort of like, well, what did we want to fix with this model? What did we want to improve on?
Tell me about Cade. I've never met him. I've never spoken to him. He seems like a fascinating character in many ways, and I know he did that paper with Richard Thaler a number of years ago about the value of draft picks in the NFL, which again, years later, seems like it hasn't been implemented very well by most teams. But what's it like working with someone like him?
Cade is a fantastic guy. He guided me through the whole senior thesis and helped me. I mean, I was someone that had a lot of enthusiasm, but I didn't have a ton of coding experience at the time, and he kind of steered me in that direction. And I would not be where I am without Cade. He's a fabulous person. He's brilliant. And, I think the work he does too, like, I mean, sports is just a side thing for him. He doesn't bet. He researches like overconfidence, optimism. He's a professor. He's technically, I guess, called a professor of the practice at Wharton, but he does organizational behavior stuff, which, I mean, I think it's fascinating. And the applications I think that the analytics has sort of become this big thing at sports, but he co-hosts or co-runs this conference every year at Wharton called the People Analytics Conference. And he's been nice enough to give me a ticket each of I missed last year, but I guess 3 straight years. And like the analytics of like hiring people and firing people and figuring out how to make organizations run efficiently, figuring out which guy is undervalued in a particular organization. Maybe he doesn't, his productivity in his particular area doesn't look that great, but he's sort of this linchpin. He helps all these people around him perform, he or she, I should say, perform at a higher level. And so I think this kind of stuff has implications far bigger than sports.
Yeah, it's entirely fascinating. And I think I've listened to too many episodes of the Wharton Moneyball show where he talks about some of this stuff, and you can just tell by listening to him, even if sports is a side gig and a hobby, it's pretty cool. One question I want to ask about betting markets. Do you sit in front of a screen all day watching lines move, or what role do you play on the betting side of things? Obviously, there's the handicapping and the modeling, and then there's the betting and the execution on the other side of it.
So I do not sit in front of a screen all day. There was a time when I did. At this point, I have somebody else doing that who's outside the United States. And I'm mostly I'm trying to automate as many processes as I can so I can free up more time to, do my podcast and to work on research and development stuff. But it's hard. It seems like things become every year things are more complex, and it gets harder and harder to have enough time to sort of spend on the R&D side. In fact, I read this book a few years ago. It's called Essentialism, and I still remember this. They said that basically if you're successful in a field, what got you there, it becomes harder and harder to sustain that success because there becomes all these other time pressures and things pulling you away from the thing that originally made you successful. And I think a good analogy, and I don't know if this is true or not, this is not an empirically based opinion, but it seems like a lot of musical artists have some of their best work early in their career when they probably have all this time to spend on the music. That's what they're able to focus on. Whereas you get successful, you get, your time you're being pulled in all these different directions. You have to, update an Instagram account saying what you're eating for breakfast to your fans. You have to tour. You have to do photo shoots, right? You don't have the same amount of time to spend on the music. And so I think I have spread myself a little bit too thin, it feels like, but it's hard to know where I can really cut things out. And at the same time, I want to sort of grow and get bigger. And it's not like, I do golf, I do baseball, and I do both professional and college football. And I feel like I'm stretched pretty thin as it is, but at the same time, like, there's all these other markets that I'm interested in. So right now I'm trying to, what I'd like to do is have everything as automated as possible so that I can attack some new things and sort of with that sort of passion that I used to have looking at new sports.
Makes sense. But do you guys have, detailed conversations about how to implement Kelly or, bet sizing or anything like that? Or are you staying right away from that?
No, so I have things set up. There's a system in place. So, someone, my trader can put what the market number is, and it'll tell him what a particular bet size should be. And I think the sport where I'm dealing with Kelly the most is probably baseball, and because you have so many games and actually you can't get down that much, but it's also the one I'm the most conservative in, just because baseball is the sport I take the most personally, because it's where I got my start. So if I have a bad season, it's the one sport where it actually does get to me mentally. Sorry, I'm getting off topic a little bit, but yes, there is guidance on bet sizing.
Do you have separate banks for each sport you bet into?
What do you mean by that?
So do you have a college football fund and a professional football fund, a golf fund and a baseball fund, or is it all just one pooled account? Nope,
just a pool of money, because there's no fund. I'm betting for myself. I have a business partner and we're betting for ourselves. It's that simple.
Makes sense. So quite literally, when you started doing this, or you set everything up to start doing this, what was the motivation? What did you set out to achieve when you wanted to bet professionally? Did you want to be wealthy and rich? Did you want to try and be, a successful gambler? Or did you want to just beat the closing line as many times as possible? Was there anything that sticks out in your mind?
I wanted to be the best. I wanted to be known. I wanted to be someone that was sort of respected by my peers as being someone that was at the top of his game. And that drove me, and I wanted to prove, and I think being able to do this for a living was a way to sort of to prove that I had those skills and that I could cut it, but honestly, I fell into this. Like, I never intended to be a professional gambler, and when I moved out to Vegas in 2008 and took a job with LVSC, the thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I know that seems a little odd. Like, I'd done a senior thesis looking at inefficiencies in the baseball betting market and developing a winning baseball betting model, but I hadn't thought about doing it for a living ever. So
if someone gets in the same position as you were back then and is starting out modeling and betting sports professionally, can they football, for example, can they take DVOA or a few other statistics and create a decent enough model and then try and execute properly and be successful? Or is there leaps and bounds more things that go into it than that oversimplification?
I mean, I would say that there is value to the execution side and the trading. And so, if you have enough, if you're monitoring a screen all day and you have a bunch of accounts and can pick off the best numbers, you can win that way and grind out an edge. But I do think something like DVOA is so well known that it's going to be priced in. And I think, and it's just sort of the same goes in baseball for like the, steamer projections or something like that, or Peabody, because that's publicly available. And so I think that there is value, even if let's say that my projections aren't as good as for baseball, aren't as good as the steamer or the Peabody, but if they're sufficiently different and they add something, that's where the value comes in. So I just think that the problem with if you just took DVOA stuff, anybody can do that. That's publicly available. It's priced into the market. Plus, their picks haven't done that well.
Well, that's another thing. How do you figure out what's priced in? Do you have a process for that?
Well, so I'm just developing my own models from scratch, from the bottom up, and so I'm creating my own statistics at each stage, trying to sort of separate fundamentals, signal from noise. And so, I guess in terms of empirically verifying what's priced in and what isn't, at the end, yes, I can kind of look and see and say, okay, like strikeout percentage is still undervalued by the market for a pitcher, which, by the way, I don't think is the case anymore. Or, turnovers might be still overvalued by the market. But at the same time, I think that, those inefficiencies are going to, if they haven't already, those are going to disappear over time. And so what I'm concerned with overall is just I'm coming up with a predicted number and I'm seeing how much predictive power that has relative to the line. And I'm not counting on the fact that it's this one particular part of my model that is where the value comes from. I'm just looking at the model as a whole because I think that those things can change. The fact that the market will catch up on something, but the pricing might get off on something else. So I kind of think if I make my model as good as I can and it has predictive power relative to the closing line, I should be solid.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one example from the playoffs that drives a lot of people nuts, especially professional bettors, is when I think it was the Chargers went to the East Coast like 3 times in 3 or 4 weeks and traveled all these miles, and they played the Patriots in Foxborough and the line was 4 or 4.5 or whatever it was, and then they lost by 1 million. And everyone says, well, that wasn't factored in, or it was factored in and it was factored in way too much, and that's why the line was only 4.5 and not 7. All of that is largely irrelevant noise because it's you and your number versus what you can bet, right?
Right, and my number is going to factor that in if it's a good number. So I think that's the thing where people are talking about trends. You have a lot of touts that will justify a pick by saying that, a team coming off of a home loss playing a team that had back-to-back road wins by 3 or fewer points is, 11-3 against the spread from week 16 onward, things like that. And the question is there any signal to that? I think the example of the Chargers and their travel, I think you can quantify the effect of that travel distance and the time zone change, and or you can estimate it. It's hard to get it down to that level of precision. It's even harder still to say what the effect is from the fact that they flew all the way back from Baltimore to LA and then back to Foxborough. But if there is an effect, I think you want to be able to. You don't want to count on a market being efficient for a particular reason or a certain thing continuing to be mispriced. I think what you want to do is be able to quantify the impact of the thing you think is mispriced into a model. And if you show an edge, then bet it. But that way you can see that way if the market is actually pricing that particular thing more accurately, because you'll see that you don't have the same edges anymore. But to your example, LA, they traveled to Baltimore the week before before New England, and played quite well there. They had the same travel schedule then. I mean, I know that the next week they had to go all the way back and forth, but I mean,
yeah, it's a bizarre thing, and now with the London games, it keeps coming up again. Like which team traveled on the Monday, or which all these travels. Even like the Broncos and altitude. It's like as if altitude just decided to appear that weekend for that game, or you see Von Miller breathing out of a machine, and it might impact his performance because he's tired, or it might be that he's getting more pure oxygen in his system, so he's gonna have more sacks or whatever it might be. It's just a bizarre narrative trend. Crazy world that we live in, especially now when everyone's seemingly trying to one up someone else with a better narrative.
Yeah, I mean that's what it is mostly, is narratives. I think there is so much information out there though that I don't know, that most people don't know. And the problem is most of it, like, I mean, there's no way of knowing these things for sure. And so I think a lot of it, and honestly, this is kind of where the art comes in, and I think my experience in this comes in, and being able to say, I saw this, there's this effect over 10 games. This looks legitimate, but it's only 10 games. It seems extreme. Like, do I think this is a real effect? How much of it is going to persist? Like, a good example for that is the Super Bowl. The fact that first halves tend to be way less high scoring than second halves. In fact, going into this Super Bowl, I believe, since 2000, second halves had 7 more points on average than first halves. And so, because one of those props for the Super Bowl is first half scoring versus second half scoring. And second half scoring has been a major favorite, like to the tune of, I think, minus 150 or so. And it's one of those where it's like, well, how do you answer that question? Like, how much of that effect is real? And I think I tend to be dubious of these things unless I can really have a narrative that I think is rock solid. I mean, you can create a narrative for the Super Bowl and say that teams are nervous, they come out tentative, they don't want to lose the game at the beginning. But why isn't that narrative the same for conference championship games where it's also a must-win game? Or Super Bowl has a longer halftime. Maybe it's that. I don't know, but maybe what happens with college football games where you have, a lightning delay or something and teams go back in the locker room for 30, 45 minutes. Should there be more scoring after that? So I think looking more broadly at things is probably the best way to answer those questions in that case. But sorry, I'm rambling on and going off of the path of.
No, that's perfect. So tell me, how do you think or you probably experienced it back then, the LVSC guys and Kenny and whoever else was there in those rooms, how did they handle those things back then, and even people today in a similar vein?
I don't know. I mean, we have more databases now, so we can do more data mining. But I almost think that looking through a database and just is almost the easier thing to do than actually coming up with a model. And it's an easy way to sound smart too. If you come up with some esoteric trend, you could sound, it sounds like you've done a lot of research on something. And honestly, it's challenging for me, like on the podcast, and if I'm talking about a game, to actually give a good reason I like the game, because it feels kind of deceptive no matter what I'm saying, and I have to actually do extra work to look up like some trend or some sort of factoid. But honestly, I don't really know if these, how much they were utilized by the LVSC guys. I would say a decent amount. But I think the reason people are drawn to those types of things is because it's the same reason people look at patterns in the stock market and sort of think that they can be able to predict it, these seemingly random lines. And it's because we tend to humans in general tend to look for patterns in things and seek explanation. Why do you think so many people are religious? We seek explanation, and we want to be able to understand something. And so we tend to if people are shown a sequence of coin flips, like 100 coin flips, they will overwhelmingly, if they don't think that and they're asked if the coin was biased or not. This was a psychological study done. Like overwhelmingly more people than did not found that it was actually, they thought it was biased. And in fact, it wasn't. Like you're going to get, streaks of like 8 heads in a row or 8 tails in a row. And that's not unusual.
So let me ask you this then. Domain expertise, how important is it to you? Like golf, for example. If you've never played a game of golf in your life, do you need to know what it's like standing over a 6-foot putt and how that impacts? Or do you need to know the ins and outs of courses? Or can you find all that out and crunch all those numbers analytically yourself without having played one round of golf in your life?
I think you need to have some knowledge of a sport for sure. And I think that for me, I'm not some statistical genius or anything. I don't have I wasn't a math major. There are people that will blow me out of the water with mathematical and statistical skills. And I think my advantage comes largely from the fact that I do love, I almost said did love, but that I grew up loving sports and loving the number side of sports and had all these questions and just theories on why things worked the way they did. And I think if you don't have those theories, you don't have anything to test. And so it's why if I was to decide to handicap cricket, I would have, I don't think I would have a big advantage there unless I really got to know the game well to be able to sort of ask questions about it. So I think it's very important.
So do you ever use subjective factors and things that you have to use the eye test or gut feel or whatever it might be to help or assist any of your handicapping?
So injuries, yeah. Injuries are one thing. I mean, they can be quite hard to quantify. If I read somewhere that this guy is dealing with the flu and I show value on him in a golf matchup, I might say, you know what, I'm gonna hold off on this particular matchup. So that's something where I definitely don't have I can't quantify the effect of it, but I'd rather be cautious than throw my money at something where I don't know if it's actually, if it's actually a good bet. I think with props, there's a lot of subjectivity as well. A good example would be the Super Bowl and the Rams running back situation with C.J. Anderson and Todd Gurley, and everybody had a theory. Well, most people just had no idea what was going on. I even heard somebody say that the theory, like that there's, that maybe Gurley had some sort of, mental condition or something, and his meds stopped working. Like, I mean, everybody, you can come up with any theory you want, but if you're handicapping a prop like Todd Gurley over under number of rushing attempts or CJ Anderson rushing attempts, I have to make some assumptions. And so they're going to be somewhat subjective. I just try to approach it in a logical way and factor in that uncertainty as much as I can. Don't be overconfident in it.
Have you reviewed how those bets have gone when you either have pulled out and not played or have gone ahead regardless of the uncertainty?
You know what? I haven't. And I wish I had, I think it would have been great if I had kept that data or jotted those down. And along those lines, I mean, think about this. Like, bets where I get market resistance. Let's say I bet some matchup at minus 120. It moves to minus 150, and then it ends up moving back to the other side and ends at minus 110. Like, what's my true edge on those? I kind of wish I had jotted those down and like had some record of all this so I could actually look and see how much that market resistance is worth. Like, because it would be good to know if I at that point should I be doubling down, betting more at minus 110, or do I say, okay, there's obviously some other people, sharp people in the market, they're moving lines that are on the other side of this, and so my number's probably not quite as strong.
It's hard being a professional sports bettor. There's so much to figure out and not a lot of time.
There is.
A question around things that annoy you. Obviously, limits is one thing, but outside of that, as a professional gambler, are there any things that you wish you could change or things you hope in the future get better?
I wish the tout industry was more regulated, even though I'm not personally a big person on regulation in general. I think it's an industry that takes advantage of people and it takes advantage of the biases in people's thinking. The fact that we do see patterns, right? I mean, we see this guy's on all these amazing streaks, 11-2 on his 3-star plays. And so they take a lot of money from people. And so I would like to see that. And I would like to see more sharp books out there in general that are willing to take action from sharper bettors. And I think that they can, I could be completely wrong about this, but I would be, it's something that I would like to actually take a stab at. And that's the fact that I think that you can be a successful bookmaker taking sharp action, investing in analytics, and like basically the pinnacle model.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
Booking like a bettor.
Yep, certainly in the U.S. market down the line.
Yeah, and if you had the ability to sort of to do both sort of the buy and the sell side, if you had access to sort of a B2B exchange, you could lay off action or take more action from, and I think, I don't know, I mean, I think it's in a way like it would be the best way to, I think it would be a great way to actually bet for a living.
Certainly, and if you're having issues with limits and getting bets down in volume and things like that, one way to solve that is to jump over the other side, but maybe that's a discussion for another day. I want to ask about all the people that reach out to you. You're pretty well known in this space. I'm sure you get hundreds of emails and Twitter messages and all that type of thing. What do you tell a lot of those people, especially the ones who are asking for advice and what to do when they're starting out?
Learn how to code, learn statistics, read books.
So on the books, have you got any suggestions?
Books related to randomness, I like. I like Fooled by Randomness, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, even though I think the guy's quite arrogant, but he's very smart. And I also liked The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver. Those two people hate each other, by the way. So
yes.
Those are the two that immediately come to mind.
What about on the academic paper side? I want to ask you about the hot hand fallacy, ? And momentum. But are there any of those that you've read and you go back to every now and then?
Well, I read all those papers back in 2007, and I have not read them since then. But I mean, I do think that actually reading all those academic papers really helped me. And in my experience during doing that internship in Vegas wouldn't have been the same if I didn't have that background. So, I hadn't actually thought about that till now, but I do think if you're inclined and you're willing to weed through some potentially dry writing, that reading those academic papers on sports betting definitely can give you some theories.
Yeah, a lot of graphs and appendices and exhibits and all that. So, Rufus, 2019, what is your thoughts, or what are your thoughts on the hot hand fallacy and generally momentum in sports? Does it exist, or is it just that it's a fallacy?
I think it definitely exists. The question is, can you quantify it, and can you distinguish the times there is truly a momentum from the times where you think there is? So, I mean, if you've played sports, I mean, like I was shooting hoops today and I hit 8 3-pointers in a row at one point just because my muscle memory, felt this, motion that worked, but then I missed like 5 in a row. So I would say after 6 in a row is more likely to make the next one. But the thing is, in sports, you rarely are repeating the same thing over and over and over again without, all this, you might, without a lot of action in between. If I would say maybe the hot hand could exist if a player got to shoot 100 straight free throws in a row, yes, but they're shooting 2 in a row generally, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is, I do think that the hot hand, in a way, I mean, recent performance is more predictive than performance further back. And so I think if you assume that someone's skills are static, then I guess the hot hand could sort of be more of a proxy for the fact that skills aren't static, and we do learn more from more recent performance.
There's so much that can go into it if you really keep digging and digging and digging and throwing in all different elements and variables, because in reality, that's the way it is. If it's your 8 3-point shots, there's more than a handful of variables. Was it at dawn? Was it at dusk? Was it in the wind? Was it all this sort of stuff, which can be thrown into the mix. So one final point, Rufus. Tell me about what the plan is for the Bet the Process podcast for the 2019 year and season, and what the plan is between Jeff and yourself.
Well, Jeff and I need to get together and sort of brainstorm our ideas for the off-season podcasts. I know we want to have a bunch of guests on, which we did last year. And last year, I think we did the podcast about every 2 weeks during the off-season. And I think we'd like to do it at least that much. I mean, maybe personally, I think we could still do it weekly. But I think I want it to be much more focused on the guests and sort of getting some people with unique experiences, both on the gambling side as well as sort of the analytics side and sort of the industry side, and especially with the future of sports betting in the United States. So that's and possibly the data side. I mean, you have a lot of interesting new data coming out and sort of how to implement that data into models and to use that predictively. I think that's a fascinating topic. So.
Well, two great hosts, I'm sure, will pry and dig deep into a lot of the guests' minds and psyches and figure out all the good stuff. So look forward to following that along, listening in, and thanks again for your time and coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me.